at an earlier point of his dynamic life, he had served as an advisor to the commanding general of the Somali police and an instructor in law and to their training school. In academia, he has taught international and constitutional law at a number of schools, including Columbia, Harvard, and Tulane, and international relations at Princeton, Johns Hopkins, and the American University. He also served as the president of the University of New Mexico. His most recent book is Confronting Global Terrorism, the Elements of a Liberal Grand Strategy, which will be published by Oxford University Press shortly. His short pieces have appeared in leading scholarly journals, such as the New York and London Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy. His talk today is under the title Confronting Terrorism Toward a Liberal Grand Strategy. It's a privilege to have you here, Tom, and please, I invite you to share your thoughts with us.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know what to do with this computer, but I'll just close it, all right? Or maybe I'll leave it open. This is too technologically sophisticated for me. Or maybe I can find a speech in there. Or I can give you more biographical notes, perhaps, other than those that my mother wrote for Ibrahim. I'm sure I speak for all of the participants in the conference in thanking the individuals like Ibrahim and Steve and Wayne and the various organizations on campus that have put together this conference, which gives us a chance to share ideas and to debate and to discover where we agree with each other, where we disagree with each other. I'm going to plunge right into my topic because it's a large topic. The time is brief, and I certainly want to leave time for some discussion. As I've said before when I've spoken here, I'm being familiar with what I'm going to say. I'm not all that interested in it, but I'm extremely interested in what you have to say about it. So let's go. But before I say something about a liberal grand strategy, let me start with the Bush administration, which I'll leave as quickly as possible, but I will start there. The Bush administration's strategic response to the terrorist attacks of 9/11 has been dictated by the right-wing pathologies that the administration channels, the neoconservative fantasies of a fearsome but benign imperialism, the garden variety chauvinism, which in all countries is a defining feature of the right wing in politics, and another of the right wing's defining features, namely the idealization of warrior values and corresponding contempt for institutional and legal restraints, whether national or international, on the leader, or if I can use the present president's idiom, the decider. Gradually, the dystopian results of that contempt, expressed in the systematic transgression of just war norms, has become apparent to all but fanatics and the mentally challenged. And in a struggle where people can choose whatever category they wish to fall into, of course, in a struggle where success depends in significant measure on isolating hardcore Islamic terrorists from the societies where they have incubated, polling data records a catastrophic surge of anger and distrust of the United States, and intelligence agencies report a marked deepening of the pool of potential recruits for terrorist organizations. Facing the equivalent of transnational insurgencies, right-wing policies are calibrated to lose the unavoidable struggle for hearts and minds. Of course, as the agenda states, I haven't come here today simply to praise the Bush administration's contribution to our national security. I've also come, as I said, to sketch an alternative grand strategy, one which I think is imminent in the doctrines, in the values, and the practices of liberalism. Now, since people use liberalism, or the word liberal, in a variety of ways, I should begin by at least offering my conception of liberalism. So let me just lay it out in terms of a few premises and moral issues. And this is in no particular order of priority. First, premises. First, that there is no single great truth about the meaning of life, or the purpose of life, or the nature of existence. That, to me, is a premise of liberalism. And to be human is to be a constructor of truths or of meaning. Secondly, that all human beings have an equal right to create meaning and identity and to change them, that is, to recreate themselves perpetually, as long as they're alive, with two qualifications to this freedom of self-creation and recreation. First, they can't deprive other people of the right to create and recreate themselves. And secondly, they must cooperate with others to maintain the community and to create the public goods which are necessary for the individual pursuit of a meaningful existence. So there are obligations other than self-creation. In this sense, liberalism is different than libertarianism. Third, all human beings other than the severely mentally disabled are agents, not objects. They have reasons which are reasonable to them. It doesn't follow that we will sympathize with those reasons, but it simply is a fact that they have reasons, a capacity to act, and they act in reasoning ways. Fourth, liberalism presumes the moral equality of people, and hence it is necessarily cosmopolitan in its sympathies. At the same time, the liberal recognizes the need of people, of most people, to identify themselves with sub-universal communities. Very few people can empathize with all of humankind. And communities have borders. Indeed, by definition, they have borders. And however large they may be, even if it's the community of Islam or Christendom, embracing 1 billion or more people, they exclude as well as include. And in order to have a community and to exclude, it's necessary that the community have some hierarchy of privilege. It has to privilege its own members. If it doesn't privilege its members, then there's no exclusion. So a central moral issue for liberals is to what extent a community can privilege its members without ceasing to be liberal. A second great moral dilemma for liberals is the extent of the demands a liberal community and liberal states can make on its members and remain liberal. A third one, also I think relevant to the struggle against terrorism, is what demands can a liberal community make on non-liberal communities? On non-liberal communities in their midst, like traditionalist communities in secular democratic European states, and in non-liberal communities residing within the boundaries of other states and acting in their non-liberal ways. And finally, there's the question for liberals concerning the conditions in which military force may justly be used, whether in the counter-terrorist struggle or for any other purpose, and the ethical limits on the ways in which force can be employed. Now, to be effective, a grand strategy must have a solid grounding in the factual world. Its ends are shaped by values. Its means, its tactics, must take account of the world that it is. That is, they must be empirically based. Thus, liberalism's first advantage over right-wing thought in formulating an effective grand strategy. For in its character, in its genealogy, and its ethos, liberalism is empirical and skeptical. Now, let's start with genealogy. As Richard Tarnas has, I think, very neatly put it, I'm quoting him now, the new psychological constitution of the modern character had been developing since the High Middle Ages, had conspicuously emerged in the Renaissance, was sharply clarified and empowered by the scientific revolution, then extended and solidified in the course of the Enlightenment, By the 19th century, in the wake of the democratic and industrial revolutions, it had achieved mature form. The direction and quality of that modern character reflected a gradual but finally radical shift of psychological allegiance from the transcendent to the empirical, from myth and belief to reason and fact, from universals to particulars. As a matter of definition, no liberal could say, as a high official of the Bush administration said to the writer Ron Suskind, "Guys like you," he said to Suskind, "are in what we call the reality-based community, which is people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality." Well, that's not the way the world works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create reality. No liberal coming out of that tradition can make that statement. Now, grand strategy must begin with a description of the problem we're going to address with our grand strategy. So we need to begin by attempting to answer the threshold questions: who are the terrorists and what do they want? Now, persons participating in the debate about terrorism policy tend to divide into two groups because of their different answers to the following two questions. One is whether global terrorism is a movement sufficiently organized and concentrated that it can be comprehensively engaged and defeated, as one defeats an enemy state in a traditional war. Or whether global terrorism is rather a multitude of geographically scattered plots, conspiracies, and insurgencies, each with its own grievances and organizational peculiarities, its particular relationship to the social group from which it springs, its distinctive identity. The other question is whether global terrorism is a response to, or at least is susceptible to, the influence of U.S. policies, or whether it is simply a response to the way we are. In President Bush's words, the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. For me, the most persuasive analyst of contemporary terrorism is a Harvard scholar, Louise Richardson, the author of a book called What Terrorists Want. What she's done is to interview terrorists. She's originally from Northern Ireland. Read accounts of interviews and interrogations, read or listen to the statements of terrorists about their motives, their means, their ends. Her analysis, in other words, is the product of empirical scholarship informed by historical perspective and integrated by the exercise of reason. Now, with respect to the first question I listed above, she clearly arrives at the side of those who see a multiplicity of groups, motives, and ends, as must anyone, I think, who examines the global incidence of terrorism. So you have the IRA or the Tamil Tigers who have a localized focus, although if provoked by perceived foreign intervention in their parochial conflicts, they can and do strike across borders. Others, like Al-Qaeda, have a transnational self-identity and a corresponding set of transnational grievances. And still others, like the Algerian organization that set off bombs in Paris during the 1990s, seem to span the two, in the sense that its Islamist members presumably felt some connection to the wider struggle of Islamist members, to the wider struggle of Islamist groups against more or less secular Arab governments, or foreign governments deemed inimical to Islamic interests, but nevertheless the Algerian groups were responding to a localized grievance, namely the French government's perceived cooperation with its Algerian counterpart in crushing or seeking to crush them. So terrorism, Richardson argues, needs to be understood and countered in detail, not on the round. Its causes in each community are, as she puts it, a lethal cocktail that combines a disaffected individual, an enabling community, and a legitimizing ideology. Now, neither Richardson nor other empiricists are arguing that diverse groups of insurgents may not also share a legitimating ideology and an associated narrative. The narrative being a tale that invariably includes acts of injustice to which the insurgency with its terrorist methods is deemed by its participants to be a just response. And the injustice in the narrative needn't be local. Its victims can be anywhere as long as they are persons with whom the latent or actual insurgent identifies. Let me propose a Cold War analogy. The writings of Karl Marx and his epigones were presumably a legitimating ideology for self-described communists in, for example, Vietnam, China, Yugoslavia, South Africa, and other countries. But each set of communists in each of these countries had its distinctive parochial grievances, challenges, and goals, stemming from their unique social, political, and historical conditions and experiences. The Marxist narrative did not create those grievances. Rather, it provided a coherent explanation of the causes of those grievances and a legitimization of transgressive responses, a guide to remedial action, and the empowering sensation of being part of a larger historical movement. Now, the defining impulse of American rightists and so-called Cold War liberals, the impulse that killed 50,000 Americans in Vietnam and several million Vietnamese, was to treat communist movements and governments as a single, integrated enemy that needed to be confronted everywhere with hard power. Fortunately, the impulse didn't always shape national policy. It yielded quickly to the realization, in the case of Yugoslavia, that Marshal Tito's communist government could be drawn into a de facto anti-Soviet alliance. It yielded very slowly to the opportunity for playing triangular diplomacy with China and the Soviet Union. It helped delay strong sanctions against apartheid in South Africa. And it triumphed, that is the right-wing view, triumphed in the case of Vietnam, where during the colonial era the Communist Party had become, unusually, the main expression of national resistance to foreign domination. Now, the call for differentiation rather than homogenization is not limited to the academy. It comes also from a new generation of counterinsurgency experts in or consulting with the state and defense departments. In a recent sympathetic summary of the views that characterize this small cohort of experts, the journalist George Packer, some of you may have read his book, Assassin's Gate, he writes, trying to summarize their views, even if we think that a jihadi in Yemen has ideas similar to those of an Islamist in Java, we have to approach them in discrete ways, both to prevent them from becoming a unified movement and because their particular political yearnings are different. David Kilcullen, who's a former officer in the Australian Army, who currently serves as a counter-terrorist advisor in the State Department, has plotted out what he calls a ladder of extremism that shows the progress of a jihadist. At the bottom is the vast population of mainstream Muslims who are potential allies against radical Islam, as well as potential targets of subversion, on the other hand, and whose grievances can be addressed by political reform. The next tier up is a smaller number of alienated Muslims who've given up on reform. And some of these, he says, join radical groups like the young Muslims in North London who spend afternoons at the local community center watching jihadist videos. They require, he says, ideological conversion. And there's a smaller number of these individuals already steeped in the atmosphere of radical mosques and extremist discussions who end up joining local and regional insurgent cells, usually as the result of what he calls a biographical trigger. They'll lose a friend in Iraq, or they'll see something that shocks them on television. They'll see a Palestinian child killed in the streets of Gaza. With these insurgents, Kilcullen says, the full range of counterinsurgency tools has to be used, including violence, but also including persuasion. And finally, there's a very small number of fighters recruited to the top tier of al-Qaeda and its affiliated organizations who are beyond persuasion or conversion. They're so committed you've got to destroy them, Kilcullen said, but you've got to do it in such a way you don't create new terrorists. A colleague of Kilcullen's, an anthropologist and Defense Department consultant, Montgomery McFate, it's a real name, explicitly dismisses the one-size-fits-all rhetoric of all right-wing publicists. She says, Terms like totalitarianism and Islamofascism, which stir the American historical memory, mislead policymakers into greatly increasing the number of our enemies and coming up with wrong-headed strategies against them. In my reading, the person, or one of the people at least, who best exemplifies the homogenizing, or what I call the reductionist cast of mind, which McFate deplores, is an essayist called Paul Berman. Anybody read Berman? Well, you should, if you haven't. Who is a self-described liberal. I'd call him a schizophrenic liberal. In his book, Terror and Liberalism, which was first published in 2003, he declares us to be at war with nothing but Islamofascism, which is an Islamic derivative of European fascism, but also, interestingly enough, European Marxism. Both of which, he says, for all their superficial differences, that would be enlightening to Marx and Hitler, no doubt, but for all their superficial differences, he sees as expressions of the inherently aggressive totalitarian impulse and the culture of death. Both of which, like all totalitarian movements, he says, rise up against the liberal values of the West. Now, on the one hand, he admires the liberal values of the West, which he says we're defending, but he writes with contempt of many of those liberals who hold them, since, according to him, large numbers of liberals have ceaselessly misread or funked the totalitarian challenge. And yet, Berman writes that he believes we need, I'm quoting him, to offer political solutions to people around the world who might otherwise become our enemies. Exactly. But how can you offer those solutions? How can you even begin to imagine them if you've convinced yourself that everyone who is attracted to a terrorist organization or sympathizes with it, indeed great swaths of society like the Iranian society and the Palestinian one, are saturated with a culture of death? And moreover, how can you begin to imagine solutions if you despise anyone who takes seriously the particular claims of insurgent groups? And you reserve your fiercest mockery for those like Richardson, who've concluded on the basis of their detailed inquiries that, this is Richardson, terrorists are human beings who think like we do and have goals that they are trying to achieve, and in a different set of circumstances, they, and perhaps we, would lead very different lives. It's not only liberalism's genealogy and ethos that make it less susceptible to the reductionist account of the terrorist threat. In addition, there is the feature that induces Berman's mocking charge. He's a big mocker, as you may have gathered. Is that a pun? I think if you speak Yiddish, it is. Mocking charge that liberals enable totalitarianism, I'm quoting Berman, through their simple-minded belief in a rational world. Now, liberalism, as I said earlier, does presuppose that human beings have reasons for their actions. And liberalism also presupposes that in addition to agency, individuals share certain primal, non-material needs like respect and belonging, and that they have a shared capacity to feel and be moved by injustice, although they may conceive of injustice in quite unusual ways. But understanding this, understanding need not and often does not correspond with sympathy. You don't sympathize with everything you understand. Indeed, if the reasons of insurgent groups are hostile to the exercise of agency by other people, liberals are bound to resist them. But reasons there are, and liberals are moved by their intellectual composition to seek to understand them. Now, understanding requires empathy, something very different, as you know, from sympathy. It's an effort simply to imagine yourself into the life experience of another person, possibly one with very different goals and ideas about how to realize those goals, but one who presumably shares with you a need at least for respect, and probably for justice, as they define it. And in the process of attempting empathy, particularly where you are empathizing with a person in another alien community, you're likely to experience a more complex historical view of your own behavior. And that, it seems to me, is an aspect of that thoroughgoing empiricism, which, as I've already said, is a salient feature of any intelligent project to formulate a grand strategy. Now, once we reject the reductionist account of our terrorism problem, not all of you may reject it, but obviously I do, once we see the constituents of the problem as globally scattered, intimate social networks whose members are standing on various steps of Kilcullen's ladder of extremism, but all linked by a legitimizing ideology and a constantly refreshed narrative, and that they are embedded in communities that are susceptible to the narrative, but whose disaffection and hence potential complicity with violence will depend on the interplay between local grievances and the narrative, which is driven by real events. Once we understand the problem in these terms, then I think we begin to see the organizing elements of a grand strategy. And the first of those elements, I would propose, is to cease thinking and speaking of the terrorist challenge in terms of a war. Calling it war associates terrorists with the titanic clash of peoples, history-changing battles, and storied feats of arms by half-mythic figures like the great Muslim general Saladin, who defeated the Crusaders and reconquered Jerusalem. And thus it plays into the hands of the terrorists by allowing them to achieve a key objective, which is glory and renown. It empowers them psychologically, and by enhancing their stature, it is bound to facilitate their efforts to recruit new members. Moreover, calling it war fosters a political environment in the United States supportive of increased investment in military instruments, when a central principle of counterinsurgent doctrine is the primacy of political and economic measures and information operations designed to isolate the violent. And calling it war activates what the historian Walter Russell Mead calls the Jacksonian side of the American foreign policy culture, the side marked by wrath and blind hatred, an impulse to exterminate, a ferocious xenophobia. All in all, a set of emotions not exactly conducive to the search Berman sensibly urges for political solutions to grievances that, if aggravated, can give the relatively few terrorists a whole sea of sympathizers in which to hide. Rejecting the rhetoric of war, cold or hot, does not entail declaring that we do not have a serious challenge to our security. Even small groups obviously now have the capacity to make catastrophes, and both their numbers and their capacities could grow. Now, liberal strategists need to act on the assumption that a sound majority of the American people are not infantile. I'm not talking of the whole, I'm talking of a majority. That they can grasp and accept the proposition that we face a substantial danger which is too dispersed, too resilient to be exterminated, but which can be limited in its capacity to affect our lives if we address it resolutely and creatively, in close and respectful cooperation with other states and peoples, at considerable expense, and with a mix of means unlike the mix required to wage interstate war. Now, during the Cold War, American commentators and officials often described it as a struggle for hearts and minds. But measured by its share of government revenues and its influence on U.S. foreign policy, the effort to influence hearts and minds never played more than a bit part in the historical drama of the Cold War. In the context of the terrorist threat to U.S. national security, the most prospectively effective grand strategy requires the former bit player seeking to influence hearts and minds to assume a leading role. They can only play that role if the substance as well as the idiom of the strategy is liberal. Of course, it is substance, the quotidian acts and omissions of the many arms of a powerful and complicated government that matters most. But the inevitably freighted language in which the president sets the general thrust and character of national policy influences that quotidian output, as it also influences the ways in which the acts and omissions of the United States and its allies are understood and assessed. The neoconservative language and policy, the policy of American, this sounds like an oxymoron, American universalism, adopted by Bush the Younger, the declared intent and at least the notional attempt to advance freedom on the end of American bayonets, with such allies as are willing to conform to American tactical and strategic judgments, this was hardly calculated to have much appeal beyond the borders of the United States. This is another element of reality that poor Paul Berman grasps. He writes, laws, formal treaties, the customs of civilized nations, the legitimacy of international institutions, these were the dross of the past, and Bush was plunging into the future. And as he plunged, he had no idea. Nobody in his administration seemed to have any idea that international law and human rights had willy-nilly become the language of liberal democracy around the world. To have a chance at effecting, this is now Farah, not Berman, that ideological conversion of alienated Muslims that the State Department strategist David Kilcullen envisions, to have a chance of creating resistance to the message of violent Islamist leaders. The idiom of our grand strategy must be the only idiom we have that connects our constitutional values with the values of people all over the globe. And that is the idiom of international human rights and international law. As Berman says, that is the idiom of liberalism. Of course, policies consistent with the liberal values embedded in human rights norms will not address all grievances, in part because not everyone now shares those values around the world. But it hardly follows that because we can't address all grievances, we should address none. In any event, it's the nature of liberals, political errors of Enlightenment thought, to believe in the gradual spread of liberal values wherever people are given the practical opportunity to have dreams and to realize them. And thus the project of liberalism is to create grounds for hope in countries around the world that those conditions can be achieved, and for belief that the nations and the communities within nations that already enjoy those conditions actually wish to admit others to the same world of opportunity. Now, a key operational implication of liberalism, one implied by Berman, is a strong preference for acting in concert with other states. And that is for multilateralism over unilateralism, which would then become, unilateralism would become the means of last resort. Multilateralism is a commitment to institutionalized cooperation on the basis of a readiness to negotiate the terms of cooperation, which in fact means a readiness to compromise on matters of tactics, strategies, and instrumental goals. In other words, multilateralism is not an ad hoc coalition of rent seekers. The word multilateralism, as I use it, is not an anodyne synonym for the United Nations. I am fully aware of the imperfections and inadequacies of the United Nations as presently constituted. I could deliver a different lecture on that, but I'll save that in the hope of getting another invitation to come back to Utah. Well, let me bring this to a close. By virtue of the attitudes that help define their place on the political spectrum, I'm talking about the right now, not liberalism. Chauvinism, suspicion of the foreign, a rigid conception of sovereignty, the masculinization of honor, and the related valorization of force. The constituencies and elites occupying the right are disabled from multilateral institution building. Liberalism, conversely, by virtue of its cosmopolitanism, that is, its commitment to the idea of rights shared by all peoples, and its corresponding dictation of limits on privileging one's community at the expense of other peoples, and its related view of coercion as at best a lesser evil, not a value, a lesser evil, inspires a search for cooperative mechanisms. After all, dominating power, unrestrained by norms and institutionalized obligations to consult, is bound to be coercive, is bound to make claims for itself that it will deny to others, is bound, that is, to reject the Kantian dictum, to take only such actions as you are prepared to generalize into rules for all. Terrorism, in the end, is violence that transgresses legal and moral limits. And I believe that at the heart of those limits is the belief that violence, if it is justified at all, must be directed against violators of basic rights, whether the violators be individuals, private groups, or states. What is above all forbidden is violence deliberately employed against the innocent and the helpless, which includes prisoners of war. The human rights conventions express this taboo by prohibiting brutal treatment and punishment without fair process, even in times of emergency. The humanitarian laws of war do the same by prohibiting retaliatory brutality. One country cannot, for instance, torture its prisoners to retaliate for torture of prisoners by its enemies. And so I would say that by its own transgressions of legal and moral limits, the Bush administration has made itself the enabler of terrorists by appearing to confirm the terrorists' account of the world as a place where the strong do what they will and the weak bear what they must. To this point, that is the Bush administration's principal contribution to the national security of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Tom filled his allotted time exactly, although we got started a little late. Accordingly, people will have to attack you further as the day goes on. We have a genuinely hard deadline at 11:40. And so if we are to carry out the next panel, we'll have to proceed immediately. Professor Polly Wiesner of the Anthropology Department is the moderator.
The next speaker is Wayne, is that right? Wayne McCormick?
The moderator.
Program changed, but I think he needs no introduction.
Thank you. I believe my role is to reflect a bit on the conference topic of values, but most particularly as a lawyer, those values that are implicated in the choice of use of forceful measures, the coercive measures that Tom mostly did not talk about. So I'm leaving to others the non-coercive measures of persuasion for the moment and talking about the legal issues reflected in society's use of force. By that, I will talk about war and crime and preventive measures. Values I take to be the basic principles of society that don't change frequently, and they don't change without good reason. I think of it this way. It's much easier to stay on a path if you don't have to wonder where the path is. Especially in times of crisis, values are the signposts that we can use to stay on a path, even if the signposts appear to be headed at times toward a cliff. We know that over time those signposts have been erected and patterned so as not to lead us astray. Terrorism presents some challenges to those values. It presents questions with obvious answers as well as questions without obvious answers. Some of the obvious answers need to be explored because they are woefully incomplete when standing alone. To start with, why is terrorism terrorizing? In terms of loss of life, terrorism pales by comparison to traffic fatalities, gun deaths, even if you just count U.S. fatalities in those two categories. Death and suffering from natural disasters impact thousands, almost always the poorer regions and persons of the globe. Human trafficking enslaves hundreds of thousands of persons every year, most of them children exploited in sex markets, but also many thousands of desperate immigrants, refugees. What is unique about terrorism? Other than the genocidal practices of some recent civil wars, it simply does not have the widespread impact of these other phenomena, yet it captures the attention of the public. We had a startling local example of this phenomenon in Salt Lake just a couple of weeks ago. On a Friday night, a 17-year-old drunk driver killed a pregnant woman and 2 of her children, a total of 4 deaths if you count the fetus. 2 days later, on a Monday, an 18-year-old gunman killed 5 people in a shopping mall. Made international news, was the subject of special editions of local newspapers for about 10 days. The first story had disappeared rather quickly. Why? What's the difference? It's something about intentional violence against strangers that is particularly frightening. I'm going to try to outline some of the values that seem to be challenged then by terrorist activity. First, the act is in your face. Never more dramatically so than on 9/11. The symbolism of the graphic television footage of the Twin Towers collapsing very, very significantly exceeded the death toll itself. Second, many terrorist acts are designed precisely for randomness. A bomb on a bus in the middle of the day, or in a shopping mall, or in a nightclub creates the impression that death can stalk in the most mundane of circumstances. A fearful populace then is a tense populace. The terrorist's hope is that a tense populace eventually will yield to some demands, or conversely will overreact and thus create conditions for further violence. Third value challenge is that the perpetrators themselves fall into either of 2 camps, either persons who appear to have the official imprimatur of the victim's own government, or they are faceless, unidentifiable persons who could be standing next to you on the street corner. Because they're not uniformed personnel of another nation's military, there are no ready avenues for seeking them out or guarding against their next act. Fourth, terrorism challenges the very legitimacy of government itself. To the extent that the terrorist can create the impression that government is helpless to protect its citizenry, the government loses not just credibility but authority itself. This creates pressure for the government, again, to overreact, to enforce severe restrictions on its citizenry, further undermining confidence and trust between government and citizen. Several terrorist books of theory talk about challenging the prestige of government, challenging the credibility, the legitimacy of government itself. Is really, we can exemplify, we can see that in the history of the United States itself with the history of the measures taken against the Ku Klux Klan. Finally, over a century after the effort first began, it became clear to other states that what happens in one state is the business of all, because a challenge to the legitimacy of government in one state is a challenge to the legitimacy of government everywhere. Now, is there something new about the international or globalization of terrorism today? We keep hearing about we're confronting a new threat or a new type of enemy. Well, there is something new, of course, just as communication, economic, and military capabilities of states have become global, so the capabilities and network structures of terrorist collectives have become global. But the threat of violence against civilian populations remains the same as it was 3,000 years ago when it first began. Regardless of the scale or complexity of operations, which creates a need for international cooperation. Nevertheless, that does not mean that society should curtail or abandon any of its long-standing values under a threat that is no different in kind than what it has faced for millennia. As I said, I'm going to leave to others the non-coercive aspects of options, and I want to address the coercive elements of public safety. There are interlocking communities of public safety, and there are interlocking legal controls on those communities. I think of it as a tripod, the protective services, law enforcement, and the military. By protective services, roughly speaking, I'm referring to the intelligence agencies and the products of their activities. Following 9/11, the U.S. has heavily emphasized the military and preventive options, while European nations have emphasized both prevention and law enforcement. The choice of how to use each of the available resources and how to allocate those resources depends on a calculus that is itself value-driven. For example, planning a major national event, such as a World Cup soccer game, starts with evaluating the likelihood of various risks and the degree of impact that would be felt if each were realized. Knowing that not all risk can be eliminated, the planner decides on a reasonable allocation of resources to meet the most likely levels and types of threat. At each stage, the calculations place a weight on human life and balance it against the resources available for protection. Each of the countermeasures carries costs that can be measured in terms of human values. Impositions on privacy, on liberty to move around, or on freedom of expression are often called into play in the name of security. Countermeasures also present value choices in how they interact with cultural norms and the values of other societies. As Tom had mentioned, being aware of the cultural values of other societies guides your choices of how to interact with them. So what I propose to do then is to talk briefly about each of those three elements of the tripod to highlight the value choices that are present with each. So first, the law enforcement approach. Prior to 9/11, the U.S. had successfully prosecuted a number of terrorism cases. Sheikh Rahman and some of his followers prosecuted for conspiracy to blow up bridges, tunnels, and buildings in the New York area. 4 persons convicted of conspiracy in the first World Trade Center bombing. Several defendants in the embassy bombing cases have pleaded guilty, and 2 were convicted after trial and sentenced to life in prison. Fawaz Yunus hijacked a Royal Jordanian flight in 1985, blew up the plane, was convicted in U.S. courts for air piracy. Omar Rizak, similarly convicted in U.S. courts for hijacking an Air Egypt flight and killing 2 passengers. Ramzi Youssef, alleged mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing, convicted in U.S. courts for, not for that, but for conspiracy to destroy commercial airliners in the Philippines. Despite the history of successful prosecutions of transnational crimes and the presence of well-trained prosecutorial teams within the U.S. Justice Department on September 11, 2001, the U.S. began using the language of war immediately in response to the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Oddly enough, the one person who cautioned about restraint in that choice of rhetoric, Secretary of State Colin Powell, of course, who cautioned that it would be a protracted effort and not a single military operation. Now, since 9/11, we had a spike in number of prosecutions of terrorist activity, cells, and planning within the U.S. under a statute known as the Material Support Statute. And those prosecutions now have declined rapidly in the last couple of years. Why is that? Have we moved resources and personnel to other matters? Have there been no terrorist plots in the U.S.? We sent all of the terrorists from the U.S. to other countries, rendition somewhere? We don't know. But clearly something has changed. The question I have for myself as a lawyer is whether the criminal justice system is adequate to the task to deal with prosecution of terrorist plots, not just within our borders, but across the globe. We have to realize that the Anglo-American legal system Okay, we're back on? Okay, did everybody enjoy the break? Okay, I will skip over a description of the Anglo-American legal system. You're familiar with all of the ways in which it tilts toward protection of defendants. Does that make it difficult to prosecute crimes of terrorism? Of course, just as difficult as it is to prosecute any other crime. The difficulty is enhanced, however, of course, by the transnational character and the clandestine nature of the organizations. Secondly, the values implicit in preventive measures, the intelligence community. Until recently, the CIA was formerly the lead agency for coordination of all intelligence analysis and presentation, but did not have the lead of resources for intelligence within the U.S. structure that lies in the Department of Defense. The 9/11 Commission made several recommendations. Chief among those were to create an overseer for both domestic and foreign intelligence to break down the barriers between law enforcement and intelligence work. And those recommendations were adopted in the Reform Act, the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004. Raises several concerns. The unifying across the foreign domestic divide first challenges the divide that was created for protection of civil liberties, primarily arising from the belief that too much accumulation of too much power in one place can result in a lack of controls on that power. Not only that, accumulation of too much power in one place can make the agency inefficient, reduces the need for it to justify its actions. Unification of all intelligence gathering in one place could eliminate competition for attention and resources, exacerbates the existing tendencies toward groupthink, collection of data to reinforce prior conclusions. All of this has been discussed particularly well by Judge Richard Posner, who is a devotee, of course, of competition in a number of different fields, but in this case he makes a pretty strong argument that the coordination needs to be decentralized to some degree. To illustrate some of the values involved in acquisition of intelligence, refer to a conversation I had with a very senior government official, which I won't bother to describe in detail. It's in the paper, but suffice to say that he was making the argument that government needs to be able to lie. It's kind of sort of a startling conclusion, but then, of course, you realize investigators routinely go undercover to ferret out criminal information. They mislead witnesses into divulging information that they might not otherwise do if they knew exactly to whom they were speaking. And I recognize that need for lying. But at some level, lying and deceit become a challenge to legitimacy. And ultimately, since the nature of an open society is the goal of our protective efforts, we have to realize that if the bad guys send us too far in the direction of controlling our own populace, then they win at some level. And this dispute is a pretty deep philosophic choice then between the competing elements of open society that is a highly complex system and which contains various threats of butterfly effect from the choices made in ferreting out information. Three particular problems. Prevention requires information that the holder wants to keep private. The more information government requires, the more likely it can prevent violence, of course, but at some point the behavior of those government officials themselves who are encouraged to lie, cheat, and steal pushes us down the slippery slope that we don't want our government officials on. Secondly, prevention requires interference with our freedom of movement. during the security planning for the 2002 Olympic Games on our campus, I often heard from faculty that they were very insistent that they wanted extreme measures taken for their safety. Of course, they also wanted wide open, easy access to their offices and laboratories and libraries. Can't do it. There is conflict. There are value choices to be made. Third, prevention implies a great deal of secrecy on the part of government, but every demand for governmental secrecy, legitimate and reasonable as each might appear to be in its own context, again threatens long-term credibility. You stack up too much government secrecy and we have a government in which no citizen can trust and which few citizens would really support. The third leg of the tripod, the military option, we obviously know much about that already. I will simply point out that the description of military is itself a bit elusive. What is military force? I think the principal distinction between military and action and law enforcement is that the military wields violence based on status of a person, while police use force based on conduct. What I mean by that is that the military is mandated to kill others on the basis of nothing more than their wearing of an opposing uniform or appearing to represent a threat, whereas law enforcement can take action only on the basis of the conduct of the other person. For that reason, we have a basic distrust of a standing military in this country. We recognize that the paradigm of war offers a broader scope of action for government than what our criminal justice system would permit, but concomitantly then we enforce rules, laws, and norms of warfare. And no credible decision maker would consider deploying military force without considering those norms and values. We talk about unchaining the dogs of war. We use phrases such as war is hell. These phrases call to mind the devastation of warfare, loss of life, displacement of families, destruction of the infrastructure of a nation. On the domestic front, even if the war is being fought in another country, notice the impacts at home. Family, social disruptions, impacts on communal spirit, either positive or negative, depending on the popularity of the war. Trust in government policymakers, and ultimately, again, trust in government itself. I'll skip over comments about the Military Commission Act. Maybe we can come back to that at another point. But I just want to say that since the heart of military operations is this emphasis on status rather than behavior, we tend to think that if a person is an enemy, then we take action against him. By contrast, justice systems work on provable behavior. By blurring that distinction with the military commissions, we run a very serious risk of obliterating the distinction between military and law enforcement, and that clashes again with the fundamental norms and values very much in the way that Tom Ferrer described about the liberal values of a Western society. Okay, final comments then. Why a value-oriented approach to policy? The practical, hard-nosed politician would be disinclined initially, of course, to pay much attention to the thought that values should drive policy. Values seem soft, fuzzy-headed, academic. They don't satisfy the hard demands of political life. But the reality, of course, is that only a value-driven approach can provide long-term solutions to a long-term problem. And the problem of violence against civilians is a very long-term problem. As a military and political historian, Caleb Carr provides some pragmatic insights into why the concept of terrorism is finally beginning to be met with near universal indignation. Terrorism begets terrorism, violence against civilians breeds hostility, eventually bringing down its perpetrator. As important as those insights are, Carr understandably sees solutions through the lens of his expertise, that of the military. And he asserts that war can only be answered with war. He ultimately reaches a rather myopic conclusion, I think, based on that perspective as a military historian. And I run an equal risk of viewing solutions through my lens of my training, which is that of the civil justice system. It would be a grave mistake, I think, for me to assert that terrorism can be addressed effectively with only a law enforcement response. I do recognize the need for preventive measures, for intelligence gathering, and for appropriate roles of the military. As a law professor, I would present you with the following hypothetical for class discussion, and you can see the dilemmas presented. Assume that your joint task force, CIA, FBI, Special Forces operatives, have pinpointed the location of a known ranking member of a terrorist organization in a foreign nation, but a foreign nation that is not friendly to the U.S. Should they try to kill him in place, try to capture him, spirit him out of the country? If the latter, where do they take him? What do they do with him? You can see the choices are not easy choices. There are very difficult value choices presented by the thought that we would send operatives into an unfriendly nation to try and spirit out and abduct a perpetrator that we wanted to bring back to the U.S. If we do, what do we try this person for? What offenses has this person committed? These are discussions that can only take place with emphasis on very long-term values of a liberal society. We have millennia of development of the notion of due process and its emphasis on the rule of law. I want to close with quoting some language from Lord Hoffman in a House of Lords opinion from a couple of years ago, dealing with executive detention of aliens without trial. He says, of course the government has a duty to protect the lives and property of its citizens, but that is a duty which it owes all the time and which it must discharge without destroying our constitutional freedoms. There may be some nations too fragile or vociferous to withstand a serious act of violence, but that is not the case in the United Kingdom. This is a nation which has been tested in adversity, which has survived physical destruction and catastrophic loss of life. They do not underestimate the ability of fanatical groups of terrorists to kill and destroy, but they do not threaten the life of the nation. Terrorist violence, serious as it is, does not threaten our institutions of government or our existence as a civil community. That's the end of the quote from Lord Hoffman. I would point out that the Canadian court just within the past week reached a similar conclusion with respect to executive detention of aliens. The reason that societies have deeply embedded values is so that the most basic principles do not have to be rethought in time of crisis when emotions are high and time is short. The most widely quoted opinions of jurists are not those that temporize and permit exceptional solutions to emergencies, but those that emphasize the basic principles and values of their societies in the face of fear. Values, not force, are what hold a society together. Thank you. You want me to stay?
I think I just did a complex mathematical calculation, and I think that we have to probably move on to the next speaker and see if there's time for discussion at the end. So we have 80 minutes left for these speakers. So I'd like to introduce the next speakers again, David Cormier, and we have Utah, who will speak on how you choices in struggle with terrorism. Oh, I thought that was Julia. Yeah. Oh, then we can have discussion. We can definitely have discussion.
Holly just reminded me of something I should point out because she didn't know. And that is Mary Haybeck sends her regards and best wishes. She took ill and could not make the trip. So I was substituting on your program for Mary Haybeck. I apologize for not pointing that out at the beginning.
Oh, so that way I think we have some time for discussion, and I'm supposed to be the coolie of the microphone. Where's the microphone that goes to the people asking the questions?
There you go.
Chat. Questions? On the first two talks, I think you could do.
Yeah, we get Tom up here too. So.
I'm wondering, Wayne, if there's some conflict between the focused work of military or enforcement officials on the one hand, and the need for a more broad-based perception of the political and, I guess you might even say, emotional aspects of the motivations of terrorists in general. Isn't there a danger that enforcement activity can provoke the very factors that engender terrorist activity?
Right, absolutely. And I think Tom did that rather well in his talk, that if you use force against even just the most committed terrorists who you cannot persuade out of a course of conduct, you run the risk of thus provoking the as yet uncommitted into becoming committed, and that's a very important value.
The broader question then is, do you see a design in the process of enforcement that is addressing that risk of
Well, that's why I think you and I, as trained as lawyers, have the rather deep-seated, I call it conservative belief in the importance of the rule of law. The due process is designed precisely for that reason, to show through a public airing of the facts that the person against whom we're using force deserves it. That just, unfortunately, will not always be possible, with, at least until, and I should say this, I am an advocate in, like Tom, I'll present another paper on this topic at a later point, of some kind of supra-state enforcement mechanism that does follow due process, but we don't have that yet. If we had a global federalist system, the International Criminal Court, for example, which could take jurisdiction and have enforcement authority that was credible, then we could downplay the military option even more significantly. But unfortunately, we don't quite have that yet.
Thank you. This is a question for Tom.
Tom, come on up.
Okay. I'm George Cheney from the Tanner Human Rights Center in the Department of Communication. Tom, I really appreciate the clarity and eloquence of your presentation. And I was wondering, just building on some of your final remarks, if you could say a little bit about points of leverage you see, even in popular culture in the U.S. today, to work against or to offer counterpositions to what you called the masculinization of honor and the glorification of war, which seem to be so, obviously those are timeless problems, but they really seem to have enjoyed, let's say, a resurgence recently. So in any domain, even outside the policy-making sphere, where do you see points of leverage or windows of opportunity to offer alternative views?
Well, you could stop watching 24, I suppose. That might be a place to begin. It is striking how the dirty secret of terrorism has suddenly become part of public discourse. This is very, very unusual. Of course, in police dramas and military dramas of various kinds, there's always been the position of there's been the Dirty Harry syndrome, Dirty Harry phenomenon. I like Clint Eastwood personally. That is, the lone avenger, whether it's John Wayne or Clint Eastwood or some other cultural icon, who transgresses against the conventions of society in extraordinary, what are perceived to be extraordinary circumstances for revenge. So it's a very embedded part of American culture. American culture is a more violent culture, is more comfortable with violence than European culture, not all cultures, but European culture, as European culture has evolved in the wake of two of the most searing experiences of the millennium, the First and Second World Wars. So they've been through a series of traumas which we have not been through, and I don't think that's the total explanation. I think we have a much more dichotomous view of moral issues. We are much more Manichaean, that we have to look at our Calvinist roots. There are many different dimensions to American culture, but anyone who's spent time in Canada, in the United States, and in Europe does perceive differences in culture, differences in attitudes toward violence. And there's no easy way to change culture in any country. These are deeply rooted phenomena. Now, I think how many of you read Walter Russell Mead's book on the American foreign policy culture, in which he divides it into four? Not very many, I gather. I recommend it to you. Like all grand views of anything as complicated as culture, it's full of simplifications. But nevertheless, it is interesting, it is provocative, it is stimulating. And he finds that there are four cultural tendencies which affect the conduct of American foreign policy. When he names them after different presidents, saying that they're not intended to perfectly mirror the views of those presidents, but they're just a shorthand. And what is the Jacksonian? And the Jacksonian, which I did invoke in my own remarks, is the one that tends to come to the fore where it's stronger in some parts of the country than others, but it tends to come to the fore in the country generally when there's a sense that we have been assaulted or insulted. And it is ruthless. It does believe that it is very Manichaean, believes that we have been assaulted and therefore we must exterminate the enemy and then return to our normal condition of a peaceable, relatively peaceable kingdom. It's chauvinistic. It is dangerous when unleashed. On the other hand, Walter Russell Mead says it's also healthy because it helps us to fight well when we are seriously challenged. And then he has the Madisonian, the Hamiltonian, which emphasizes let's call it the bourgeois side of American history and culture, the emphasis on business. The function of the state is to help business nationally and transnationally. It can be violent or it can be, but I think its tendency is not violence, because violence interrupts business. There's the Jeffersonian, which emphasizes democracy inside the United States, the importance of preserving democracy. We do not go abroad, John Quincy Adams, we do not go abroad to slay dragons. We sympathize with the ravaged and impoverished and beaten abroad, but we worry about foreign adventures. We worry about going to war because of the impact on our own democracy and so on. So I think he's right in emphasizing that there are different cultures of foreign policy, or different cultures which profoundly influence foreign policy. He's suggesting that often these cultures kind of balance each other, but that at certain moments, 9/11 was a galvanic moment, at certain moments all the cultural forces push in the same direction, or some are clearly subordinated. And you could argue that we, since 9/11, although perhaps less so in the last year or so as a consequence of disasters in the Middle East, we were in a Jacksonian moment. And that made it possible, made it perhaps inevitable, or certainly likely, that we would engage in the policies that we did. And maybe we are emerging from that Jacksonian moment now. But to talk about points of leverage for changing profound cultural forces would be facile. They are there. In the end, what do? You appeal to reason, you appeal to moral values, and you appeal to prudential values. And if you think about my talk, it really was an effort to it was an optimistic effort to suggest that the promotion of liberal values is consistent with the lessons or with a prudential program, values aside, for dealing with the terrorist threat and containing it. Now that may be optimistic, or you could say it's because you believe in those values you want to think that they coincide with practical reason, just as neocons believe in imperial values and want to think that American imperialism, and they're not bashful about it, I'm not making up the term, they're comfortable with the idea, will lead to a better world and to the promotion of liberal values. So we need to discount both of our biases in terms of the practical steps that we propose.
Thank you.
Maybe one more, and then we should move on.
I have a question for each of you, a somewhat different question. For Tom, you started by saying that there were two postulates that I recall from your talk about liberalism. One was that there was no grand theory of truth, and second, that one needed to be empirical. And I guess I'm wondering whether liberalism confronts the possibility that it may be wrong, that there may be a grand theory. And second, the empirical challenge is that most people in the world believe in one grand theory.
Or another.
Or another.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering how you deal with that, sort of at the intersection of what might be called the illiberal dimension of liberalism. And for Wayne, your suggestion was that we need to sort of maintain this crime-war distinction. And I think that 9/11 really challenged that. There was, in fact, a lot of rhetoric around what the attack should be called. Was this a crime against humanity? Was this a war against the country, or a war against a certain civilization? And it seems to me that it's not status or conduct, but rather a risk assessment that's involved in what triggers violence. That is, what is the risk to ourselves, our society, in terms of where we deploy violence. And in the case of someone shooting at me, I'm going to try to get them before they get me. In the case of where I've got the person in detention, the conduct has occurred, I have a different set of values that kick in terms of the process and the mechanisms of control at that point. So I'm interested in whether, one, to be pointed, whether you would characterize 9/11 as a crime or as a war, and what your thinking is about maintaining that distinction in light of that kind of challenge. So first, Tom.
Dean is one of the great questioners that I've ever encountered, because I've encountered his questions before. They're always brilliant and pointed. I send out an annual holiday letter to friends and acquaintances and colleagues, and a year ago I sent out one really stating what my conception of liberal values and how it should affect people's views about coexistence with values that they don't share. And I got a letter back from a very distinguished scientist who's on the faculty at the University of Denver, who said that he thought that my approach was very illiberal. And I think that's the point. It was intolerant. I talked about attitudes toward the gay community and toward abortion, and it was sort of my message was sort of libertarian. And he said that itself, this disparagement of people who feel, implicit disparagement of people who feel that these are absolute values, is itself intolerant. And this is not an unreasonable reaction. It's a reasoning reaction, and I think you've put your finger right on that. In the book I've just finished, I have a long chapter which is mostly about how European secular liberal regimes and societies should deal with traditionalist communities within Europe, in the Netherlands and France and so on. And same set of issues, I think. You could say that at its heart, liberalism is a strategy. It is a strategy for allowing communities of people with deeply different views about the nature of the good life, of the moral life, of the just life, to coexist without violence. That it is the only alternative to the Hobbesian or Millian world where the good do what they will and the weak bear what they must, that there is no alternative. So it may be that many any individual liberals may in fact believe there is one great truth. And you could say the one great truth of liberalism is that people should not impose their views by violence, and that finally is bedrock. That's my conviction. And I'm willing to use force against those who will challenge that conviction. So I'm not a pacifist, as you may have gathered. But that's where I would draw the line. So I'm willing to tolerate a good deal of behavior that I despise simply in order to maintain a society which is relatively peaceful, on the theory that in such a society there'll be more opportunities for the realization of my values, which is the right of people to create and recreate themselves, to be agents, than a society which is riven by conflict. Because I have seen societies, I have lived in societies, I've investigated societies riven by conflict, and that seems to me the greatest risk to every value that I possess. So that for me is the bedrock of liberalism, to provide a formula, as it were, for people with very different views about what is good, just, and moral, to coexist peacefully. That's my bottom line.
Well, I'm glad Dean Shodash gave me the easy question. No question in my mind that the acts of 9/11 were crime. There are a variety of ways of measuring the difference between war and crime, but when you have a reasonably small group of clandestine actors without any pretense of political sovereignty or territorial control, where they are identifiable as a unit, with all of those elements, I have a criminal organization. I do not have a political entity with war-making capacity. And I can cite to several descriptions by Noah Feldman, Jordan Paust, among others, that make this point pretty thoroughly, I think. But the harder part of the question was then, so therefore, what would I do about it, essentially? I think the law enforcement option in that instance would have to be carried out with the assistance of the military. I have no problem whatsoever with the initial invasion of Afghanistan because the Taliban regime was not going to hand over the perpetrators. Once you've made the demand for their extradition or rendition and that is refused, you then go in to ferret out and seize the perpetrators that have committed a crime on your territory. I have no problem with that. My problem is the language of war, which then carried well beyond that one initial military operation that was necessary for the law enforcement mechanism to take hold.
Could I just a word to that? Wayne, in international law, if you go back and look at any of the classic works in international law before the Charter, let's say, of the first part of the century, like Oppenheim's Lauder Pact, there are two volumes, one war, the other peace. In the volume on peace, there's a whole section on uses of force short of war. And one of the rules of international law was if a state, a sovereign state, cannot control its territory, cannot prevent, or doesn't choose to prevent, its territory from being used for actions which are injurious to another state, to that extent its sovereignty is suspended, and the other state can enter the state to terminate, if depending on the gravity of the threat and injury, to terminate those acts. And that's not an act of war. Now, to a great extent, what we decide to call war is a personal choice, depending on what we think the value and practical consequences of calling it war are. We invaded Caribbean countries, roughly 25 to 30 times in the period 1900 to the beginning of the Good Neighbor policy in 1933. We didn't call them wars. If we had called them wars at that point, probably presidents would have thought it was necessary to get the approval of the Congress. We called them interventions, we called them defense of citizens, defense of property, various terms, and there is, as I say, there's language in international law, pre-charter international law, which recognized that force will be used from time to time, far short of war, to deal with violations of your, or at least presumed or pretended violations of your rights. So there are uses of force long recognized in international law and international relations short of war.
What are the consequences if we run over? I know Tony is dying to ask a question, but we would have to go on. So what?
Well, I think we probably should make Tom and I sit down, and if there's time left after Frank and Marilyn, then we'll come back. And we have 2 days. Thank you.
Okay, so, the next speaker is Frank Salter from the Oxfam Institute in Andex in Germany, and he will talk on ethnicity and indoctrination for violence.
While the computer's warming up. The need for empirical analysis. So what I'll be doing pretty soon, now, is running through a framework. Really, it's a framework rather than a proper behavioral analysis. This will be a framework for the sort of things we need to be doing to break down some of these values into behavioral units. There's meant to be a picture of Mr. Bin Laden on the right there, but I think we can do without that. And because there are some complicated bits, I'll do it sort of in a word picture way. So we'll just run through like this. So the problem is terrorism, obviously, is increasing in scope, increasing in frequency and deadliness. Suicide bombings have been increasing in frequency since 1980. Let's not dwell on that. It's a well-known phenomenon. Here I've scanned a textbook, a popular thing for students. It's an atlas of global issues. The red areas are states in which terrorist groups are operating. It's bases, areas where they're operating where terrorism has occurred. And these flashpoints are, for me, the most interesting phenomenon, suicide bombings. Between 1997 and 2002, about a 5-year period. There's a concentration here, of course, you'll see, in the Middle East. We know this. It's a mass phenomenon, global phenomenon. We know it. It's in school textbooks now. The analytical problem is, for me, from a behavioral point of view, why do people do it? Pretty common sense. And even some of them kill themselves in order to kill us. That's, for me, the hub. Why would someone want to kill us so much that they'll kill themselves? Extraordinary behavior. Now, there's lots of ideas out there, lots of explanations and theories, and a very common one is, well, these people are indoctrinated. They're somehow fooled into doing it. Fooled, tricked, indoctrinated, trained. After all, these are terrible things that they're doing. These are bad things that they're doing. So their values must be wrong. There must be somehow values being imposed on these people. These people themselves, in a way, they're perpetrators, but they're also victims. And we know that, yes, indeed, there is a lot of indoctrination going on. We know there are recruiters out there. There are camps. There are schools. The United States has targeted, I think from President Clinton on, has been targeting some of these facilities. In fact, some analysts focus on this as the cause. This is the cause. It's going to be indoctrination. If we can understand how these people are trained to do it, and I can see you getting ahead of me with Mr. Dawkins. Mr. Dawkins, in his defense, I'll say this, he published this in the New York Times just after 9/11. It was not long after 9/11. So let's remember the context. But I find this an extraordinary quote from someone as clever as Mr. Dawkins. And now notice, before I just read through it, not one reference to grievance. not one reference to values, these people as thinking rational agents. They're just after 72 virgins. Testosterone-sodden young men, too unattractive to get a woman. How would he know that? In this world, might be desperate enough to go for 72 private. So why do they kill us? To get the virgins, for God's sake. It's the virgins. Is it any wonder that naive and frustrated young men are clamouring to be selective? You can see I'm not very happy with this approach. The problem is that indoctrination is really difficult to do. Very difficult. If we had an advertising executive here, I think he would agree, yeah, you need big budgets, you need really clever copywriters. And then it's iffy. If you've got competition, if you get your demographic wrong, if you target your message badly, indoctrinating people against their values is costly, manpower and time. Now, you won't be able to read this, but there's a simple point to make here. What I've done here is list methods of persuasion from the most effective full brainwashing as used by Communist Chinese in the Korean War. It's documented by American researchers. It's beautiful job. There were some classic research in the 60s and 70s. And we go through deprogramming techniques, also used in the United States to take young people out of cults. And then we have traditional initiation in traditional societies. The Moonies, one of the best known cults, have a wonderful indoctrination methods. But by the way, working on self-selected people who come along and present themselves and say, I'd like to join, tell me more, and then voluntarily attend a camp. And as you see, as you come to the right, the number of techniques used, here are the techniques used to indoctrinate people. And as we move to, say, advertising, good old capitalist advertising, you've got repetition, and you have prestige testimonials. Unfortunately, I think our advertising executive will be sad about this, but you can't arrest people, put them in prison, and really go at them, hammer and tongs. As you can look at the number of techniques used. Full brainwashing, extraordinary number of techniques used. It's incredibly expensive, costly, inefficient process, and it's uncertain. There's no guarantee that when you've run through this for 2 years, a year or two, keeping someone isolated, a little bit of torture always helps, a bit of food deprivation so their mental faculties break down, and even then it's not foolproof. I'm not convinced by the indoctrination theory. We need to be looking elsewhere. Now we know that, now let's start looking at some of the values that these people hold, some of the why would they as rational actors be doing this? We know that terrorism is conducted in the name of a community or a nation. It's somehow viewed, at least by the terrorist, as an act of defence. It's something to do with ethno-religious identity. Identities are important. It's something to do with territory, right? Something to do with suffering on the part of the terrorist community. We know that's a big factor. Terrorism is conducted on behalf of suffering communities. It's something to do with blowback. That nice word, that nice phrase. The weak against the strong. Terrorism is a tactic of the weak against the strong. Now we're getting towards values. But the blowback argument is usually expressed, and this is my problem with this. I sympathise with this approach, but it's too common sense to be analytically very useful. One can't go too far with it in formulating policy because it does make sense too easily. And then you say, and? What I want to do is unpack some of this. I think we get to here's the hypothesis I'll be throwing up. That in the absence of real threats, but what really counts is threats to the identity group of the individual. The terrorism is in fact a defensive reaction against an ethnicity, a religious community, or a nation. And without that, we know that indoctrination is involved, but without this value set that these people have at that lower level, at a mass level, indoctrination is going to be too inefficient. So in a way, I'm critiquing the indoctrination hypothesis. Now, that's nice and easy so far. Now it gets a little bit complicated, and I'm going to run through just a framework. So I'll just be showing you some of the categories of the behaviours that we would need to be looking at to really get down to the nitty-gritty of people's behaviours. And luckily for me, someone's been there before me who's going to help. But before we get to him, we'll look at some of the categories we're looking at. We need to understand what we mean by ethnic group. Everyone thinks, oh, I understand ethnic group, nation, state. Let's quickly look at some of the definitions that are arising. Here are four definitions we have to look at quickly. And the reason we do that is we're going to be taking out values from these communities. What defines these different corporate entities? And I've highlighted some of the key components that inform the values, I think, of terrorists. An ethnic group, an ethnic community, it has a name. They all have names. If they don't have a name, if it's a population with a certain gene frequency, that's not an ethnic group. It's self-aware, and it's recognised by other people. A myth of common ancestry, extraordinarily important point. A myth of common ancestry, and typically it's not completely mythical. Typically there's a core of reality. Shared historical memories, can be religious. One or more differentiating elements of common culture, can be religious. An association with a specific homeland or territory, extraordinarily important, as we're going to see. A sense of solidarity for significant sectors of the population, extraordinarily important. The suicide bombing, solidarity. Then we move on to nation. A collective proper name, that rings a bell, collective proper name. Occupation of a historic territory, that rings a bell. Common political myths and memories, often a core or originating ethnic group. Nations often, even if they're completely multi-ethnic, they arose around a core originating ethnic group. And of course, being an ethnic group, it has a myth of common ancestry. And then nations also have an integrated territorial economy and communications infrastructure. In other words, things happen. It's a corporate entity. It talks with itself, and a mass public culture. Nationalism. There's particularistic type and universalistic type. Terrorists are not motivated by universalistic nationalism of the type of Woodrow Wilson. They're motivated by defence and the survival and the autonomy of their people. So this is what nationalism of a particular type. A social and political movement for attaining identity, unity and autonomy on behalf of a group whose leaders believe it to constitute a natural or potential nation. Nationalism is the most powerful legitimating force in the world today. There are many such forces, but this is the most widespread. We haven't yet got over the 19th century vogue. It's not just a 19th century thing. It wasn't just a 20th century thing. 2 world wars did not end it. It's a fact. So we have to understand it. And the state. I just mainly wanted to, because people sometimes get confused. So you'll hear a presidential address saying, where the word state and nation are used interchangeably. The nation is often used, when what is meant is the state apparatus, or the legal entity of the United States or Britain or Australia. And notice, a state is not a nation. A state is not an ethnic community. And also notice, now going back to what we've done, I'll just pick out some of these core ideas. Common ancestry played a role in these identities that are involved in conflict. Common ancestry, a homeland is involved. Common culture, which can include religion, in ethnic and national identities. Okay, so we've got some basic definitions. And now here's the man who's helped me tremendously with this by providing a framework. Bill Charlesworth He's Professor Emeritus in Developmental Psychology at the University of Minnesota, I think, University of Minnesota. He's written a brilliant paper where he didn't present a hypothesis so much as a framework in which to position our hypotheses of behavioural mechanisms. And I'm summarizing up a brilliant paper in 4 lines here. He said what we do is we need to focus on the individual. Well, we're talking about behaviour. Let's look at the individual, how an individual develops from birth through puberty, from puberty to adulthood, young adulthood. And then, right at the moment when the command comes or the decision is taken to blow him or herself up or to commit a terrorist act, but being a modern developmental psychologist, he talks about evolution as well. So he's going back millions of years to the origins of the species. And what is incredibly wise about this, I think, is that we need to be understanding terrorist acts in terms of human universals, in terms of values that we could have. This was a point made earlier by both of you. I think if we're going to understand them, we need to be able to actually put ourselves in their positions, try at least to go through their life sequence and maybe understand, if not sympathise, but understand with how they could get there to this extraordinary situation. Predisposing causes, evolutionary, facilitating causes, the developing child up to the beginning of political awareness, religious awareness, becoming an autonomous actor, sustaining causes, so we have the young adult going through, observing the world, observing political, social events, joining radical movements, volunteering for violent action, imagining suicidal attacks. This is the fully acting adult. And then we have the final. And what interests me most is this part and this, although all 4 are important. How much time do I have left?
A little more than about 7 minutes.
I think we'll just squeeze in the framework. All right. And this is the last little bit of complexity. Not another picture, doesn't it? We now take those definitions we've looked at, we take the framework of Bill Child's work, and we can flesh it out. Over the last 30 years, there's been a lot of work done on ethnic behaviour, behaviours that impinge on ethnic-type behaviour. Why don't we do the same with economic behaviour, or hierarchical behaviour, or democratic behaviour? We're looking at ethnic, and I mean ethnic in the broad sense of an ethno-linguistic religious community. It can be weighted differently. And we have 6 mechanisms. There could be more, but these are very important mechanisms. And I'm going to have to spend about 30 seconds on each. People are sought by similarity. It's a remarkable phenomenon confirmed around the world. I think the one thing they don't sort on is risk circumference, as I recall. It's quite remarkable. But one of the strongest assorting factors is ethnicity, religion, friends and spouses. They're sort by ethnicity, religion, and so on. Social identity processes. This research goes back to the 1950s, where we had groups of boys, for some reason boys chosen at random, separated into groups, and manipulated. Next thing, they have a mini war raged between them. Our group, in-group chauvinism, out-group hatred and aggression. Extraordinary. Extraordinary phenomenon. We are set up to do this psychologically. We have this capacity, not deterministic. We have this capacity. Strong cultural influence. Humankind's cognition. This is amazing. This is a relatively recent work by Mr. Hirschfeld in California, another developmental psychologist, who finds that by age 4, this is a universal, the developing brain learns to spontaneously look for dissent groups So it distinguishes, categorizes people into descent groups. Oh, that's a family. That's a race. By age 4. And it's a genetically directed program. We are programmed to categorize our social environment in these terms. That doesn't mean we attack. I'm not suggesting that. But this is just cognition. This is not values. This is just cognition. Collectivism. Strongly culturally directed. There are collectivist cultures. There are hyper-individualist cultures such as the United States and other Western societies, many in between. But the capacity for collectivism is clearly a universal, a species universal. People who have a collectivism mentality, before they act, they think, how will this influence my family? Is this good for my community? Well, an individual will think, I have the right, let's go. I want to do that, I'll do it. Right? So it's a spectrum. You have a lot of diversity on this, but there are some cultures that are more collectivist. Typically, cultures that are under sustained attack or threat or humiliation become more collectivist. Finally, territoriality. Lots of debate about this. Basically resolved. We're a territorial species. We have property. We have concepts of what's mine, what's not, and we extend that to territory. And very importantly, at the ethnic level, as you recall, an ethnic group has a home, doesn't have to live on the homeland anymore, but Greeks everywhere know that there was this place called Greece, vaguely. There's this place called Greece and things happen there, and somehow that's my homeland. Of course, in the nation lives on its territory. And finally, very importantly, altruism. Species universal, it's a capacity to give till it hurts or kills for others. Okay, so we have 6 behaviours. And what I want to do is just show how they fit into Charlesworth's framework. What have I got, 3-4 minutes left?
Yes.
We're looking at the evolution of the evolutionary background to aggression, war, terrorism. Basically, all those 6 values I mentioned are evolved. They're all species universal. The capacity for them is universal. It's evolved, and many of them you find in other species. Chimpanzees are territorial. They can show altruism, especially to kin. Then we come to facilitating courses, 0 to 12 years, birth to puberty. This is badly researched. I won't dwell on that, except to say that it seems to me that a community under threat, a community under stress, could very well produce individuals with heightened territoriality, heightened code of honour, heightened collectivism, and so on, heightened altruism towards the group. That would be an adaptive response. Badly researched. What is better researched, much better researched, is this phase. This is the young adult picture. A young adult. And you can see, I think, every one of those behaviours is engaged or potentially engaged when you have a community under threat, a community whose territory is occupied, that's being insulted, degraded in some way, frustrated in its aspirations. The background group formation being performed by affiliation, by similarity, ethnic networking, that's a diffuse one, social identity mechanisms. People will want, every healthy person in that community will understand that there are different, they'll know that there's an occupier, that there's an attacker, and that there's us, and they won't feel happy about the attackers. Humankind's processing helps the cognition of this. Carried to an extreme, Erik Erikson argued for pseudo-speciation. Carried to an extreme, it can lead us to categorise our enemy as non-human. And imagine what that can have in releasing us from moral constraints. If the enemy is a set of beasts mentally, it's very important, and this hasn't yet been worked through, what the implications of this are. collectivism. I think this is probably going to turn out to be involved with the suicide ability, the ability for people to kill themselves. Now just remember, the person with a strong collectivist mindset thinks, okay, what I want is one thing, where I'd like to go. But what's good for my community? What do they need? This is, social responsibility, leading people to self-sacrifice, maybe to join a military unit, a terrorist cell. Territoriality, well, if your society's being occupied. Altruism, self-sacrifice. And I can finish up in 30 seconds. What does this mean? What then would my suggestions be if this framework works out, if this hypothesis is confirmed? Well, instead of, or in addition to attempting to destroy the enemy's infrastructure, remove the threats. Remove the stimulus to these values being formed. There's nothing too profound about it. I'm back to common sense. Political solutions would involve withdrawing threats against people, culture and territory, and where there are conflicts of interest, looking for political solutions. Thanks very much for your time.
People obviously differ in the degree to which they display those sorts of traits. And then there's also the sort of behaviors that we might call, people differ in the degree to which they display those behavioral traits that you were talking about. And there are also traits that we might call traits toward liberal cosmopolitanism. Does anybody give a kind of evolutionary account of where those traits come from and speculate on of triggering circumstances that might lead people to have more cosmopolitan attitudes?
I'm not aware of good research on that, but I'll give you my idea. What else? I think that a liberal cosmopolitan perspective starts from security, starts from a position where a society has been secure for a long time. But perhaps it can be sped up. But I think you don't get a liberal cosmopolitan mindset from fear and from a society that's been ravaged and under threat. And recall, there's some political theory in this direction. The first liberal democracy in Europe was Britain. Britain was in last in 1066. And it was relatively easy to defend. It was difficult to invade. So there's an argument that says, because the realm itself was secure, you could have a relaxation of the martial spirit and so on. I hope that answers.
A lot of people wanting to talk. So we go 1, 2, 3. Okay.
What about the counter proposition that there are leaders within groups who play a decisive role in shaping outcomes and outlook, who believe that threats against them could not be withdrawn, that there is something in the structure of the culture of the other side, whatever that side is, that they see as intrinsically aggressive and abrasive, and hence that mode of thinking would continue. I mean, it is the logic of small numbers, not the logic of huge masses that would be operative here.
Yeah, I don't think that this analysis and the simple solution I offered would eliminate all terrorism. I think I'm just talking in terms of numbers. And you'll have the occasional psychopath. To extend that, you'll have the occasional psychopath who'll do damage for the fun or for the interest. But what strikes me is the number of volunteers that are coming through. Now just take Iraq. Every week we have not just suicide bombings, but suicide bombers being used as like guided missiles. So you have one suicide bomber, a crowd gathers around the devastation, then a second one, and then a third one. It's clearly it's not just a tiny trickle. Clearly there's a supply, they have a supply chain, you can process these people efficiently. And what has to be explained is how can indoctrination for these extraordinary behaviours extraordinary behaviour of the whole strapping it on. And I don't believe that religious indoctrination removes the fear completely. I just don't believe that. I think that it helps, gives some comfort. I think Mr. Dawkins is wrong. I think we must look at the positive values and motives that are informing these people. It won't answer the problem completely, but it will solve part of the problem, I think.
We've got two more quick ones here, and then we have to move on.
I'll try to be quick.
My question is, in some sense, the other side of that coin. You seem to threat as some sort of an objective condition, but it seems to me that it is very often very subjective, and it is created, and indeed maybe part of the identification of ethnic or nationalism. And so to simply say, well, we can withdraw the threat, I think overlooks the possibility that there really will be, say, with ethnic identity, very different kinds of reactions to a situation of threat, which really is inherent in that self-definition.
Yes, I suppose, just to continue, if one can have failed states, I suppose one can, might in principle have failed ethnic identity, but in that circumstance has an autocatalytic reaction with the world. For example, would this fit your idea? You have leaders or an elite group that generates a sense of threat. Yeah, true, absolutely. Again, I'm not suggesting this is the cause and that's the answer. I think it's just an element, but I think a big element. I think what would happen, and I don't think that one solution will answer all the problems. I think this is pulling the rug out from under the feet of these values and motives. But other things, for example, you have the hard-headed committed terrorist who has to be dealt with. I have no problem with that at all. Okay, we're up. We're one more.
Part of your account is an account of what pushes an individual over the brink to, say, become a suicide bomber. And I've heard accounts that also suggest that a kind of limited altruism for families plays an explanatory role in the sense of insurance systems that provide support for families when someone dies in this enterprise. And I wonder if you see that as an alternative explanation or playing any kind of role at all.
Do you mean the case where the family of the suicide bomber is
compensated?
Yeah. No, I mean, that fits perfectly, I would think, because if I'm a suicide bomber and I'm doing this, not because I'm an evil person, but because I've lost a brother, killed by the security forces. My father was humiliated. I saw him at a checkpoint, just humiliated. And my people have been killed. So I'm doing this for family and community. And then I'm told, by the way, if you do this, $10,000 will go to my family. That completely fits my collectivism, it fits my altruism, it fits the whole value set that I'm doing this for. There's no problem there.
Okay, we've got to cut it now, or else we won't have lunch. We won't get lunch. The next speaker is Marilyn Friedman, and she's going to speak on female terrorists.
I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference, Dean Chatterjee, and everyone else involved for inviting me here. I'm really enjoying it thoroughly and delighted to meet everyone who's part of this group. The title that's in the program is abbreviated. Originally, the full title was Female Terrorists, What Difference Does Gender Make? So this is a larger project. And it makes a number of differences. And I've selected out one strand, so actually the more specific title for this particular paper is Female Suicide Terrorists, Martyrdom and Gender Equality. Now, obviously, if we're going to explain why women become suicide terrorists, we can't use the 72 virgins explanation. In fact, there have been attempts at finding some sort of alternative of what might happen in paradise. So I've read the suggestion that some of the terrorist leaders talk about how the woman becomes re-virginized. Or is perhaps the head virgin of the 72. She's the most prominent one. So I'm not sure what explanation has been settled on yet, but this is challenging various terrorist doctrines. Suicide terrorism is especially deadly. In the period from 1980 through 2003, just 3% of the terrorist attacks around the world were suicide attacks. Yet according to Robert Pape, who collected comprehensive data on those attacks, they caused 48% of all the deaths due to terrorism during that time. And this figure ignores the huge losses of September 11th. So my paper is about female suicide terrorists. Now, female gender can be advantageous to terrorism in a number of general ways. Women can sometimes be more effective as terrorists than men. Gender stereotypes lead authorities to monitor suspicious young men for signs of terrorist activity and to ignore women. So female terrorists may find it easier than men to gain access to terrorist sites, to target sites. As well, women's terrorist acts may also attract more of the desired publicity than men's terrorist acts. Public audiences seem to be both repelled and fascinated by women who kill. In addition to women's general advantages for terrorism, they can become suicide terrorists, I think, more easily than they can become regular terrorists. Detonating an explosive belt does not require a lot of combat strength, endurance, stealth, or knowledge of how to handle weapons. Ordinary women who lack special military training and have usually not been socialized for physical aggression can become suicide terrorists. 462 people committed acts of suicide terrorism from 1980 through 2003. Robert Pape was able to get information about the sex of 381 of them, and 59 of those, or 15% of the total of 462, are known to have been female. 15%. They've worked with Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, the Chechen rebels, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam committed about 200 suicide acts in that period, 1980 through 2003, and apparently used women in 30 to 40% of those missions. The female suicide bomber unit of the Tamil Tigers is called the Black Tigresses. These women have been particularly effective. The female suicide terrorist with perhaps the highest ranking victim ever was a black tigress named, and I apologize if I mispronounce, Themuli Rajaratnam, known as Danu. In 1991, Danu approached Rajiv Gandhi at a political rally where he was running for re-election as Prime Minister of India. Danu blew the two of them up, killing 16 other people in the blast. Women did not become suicide bombers for the Palestinian cause until this millennium. On January 27, 2002, Yasser Arafat gave a speech at his compound in Ramallah intended specifically to recruit Palestinian women. Over 1,000 women came to hear him speak. Quote, "Women and men are equal," he proclaimed. Quote, "You are my army of roses that will crush Israeli tanks," end quote. On the spot, Arafat coined a new word, shahida, a feminine form of shahid, the Arabic word for martyr. That afternoon, Wafa Idris became the first shahida to commit suicide bombing for the Palestinian cause, in particular for Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. Wafa Idris blew herself up at a shopping district in Jerusalem, killing an 81-year-old man and injuring 100 other people. And sometimes we don't talk often about the injured who survive these attacks, who are often severely maimed for life, and who have to carry those injuries for the rest of their lives. After her suicide, Wafa became a hero to the Palestinians. Her photograph was displayed on buildings all over the West Bank. Halim Kandil, a Middle Eastern editor, wrote, quote, "She is Joan of Arc, Jesus Christ, and the Mona Lisa," end quote. The Mona Lisa? Wafa Idris was soon followed by other female suicide terrorists from the fundamentalist Muslim as well as the secular Palestinian groups. In my paper, I'm going to explore the cultural conditions that surround Palestinian women's acts of suicide terrorism on behalf of the Palestinian cause. From some Palestinian perspectives, these heroic acts of martyrdom also constitute an important sort of gender equality in Palestinian society. And that's ultimately what I found intriguing. How genuine is that alleged gender equality? And how does it alter the morality of the martyrdom that is involved? Now, first, some comments on the general morality of suicide terrorism without specifically looking at women's participation in it. Terrorism these days is typically defined in part in terms of the intended killing of innocent persons and or non-combatants, and the distinction between those concepts doesn't matter for this paper. From a deontological perspective, the death of a person who does not deserve to be killed cannot be justified merely in terms of a greater social good of any old sort. It could only be justified, if at all, for the sake of preventing a greater evil of at least the same degree of moral magnitude as the killing of the innocent. For example, to prevent an even greater number of killings of innocent persons. If a military occupation, say, brutalizes and humiliates a people, leaving them no realistic option for peaceful resistance, then terrorism for the sake of liberating that people from the occupation could possibly be justified. And here I'm expressing my own point of view about this. I will proceed by assuming without further argument both that acts of terrorism could possibly be justified, but that the justification would be a very demanding one. It would not be an easy argument to make. Now, my first question is this: what does the suicide of the suicide terrorist add to the morality of the terrorist act? Imagine an act of terrorism that leads to the death of, say, 10 people. Would the act be morally better, worse, or merely different on moral grounds if the same 10 people were killed by a terrorist who also killed herself intentionally as the means of killing the others? Terrorism has been described as part politics and part theater. One aim of terrorist violence is to gain publicity and win sympathy for the cause, or win more converts to the cause. Suicide terrorism can aid in this effort by the dramatic manner in which the terrorist shows the strength of her commitment to the cause. In the face of someone's extreme self-sacrificing devotion to a cause, even some people in the population targeted by a suicide terrorist may give some thought to whether or not she fought for a worthwhile cause. And for those who continue to oppose the suicide terrorist's cause, the rhetorical power of her display of commitment is so forceful that it must be publicly discredited. She must be portrayed as a fanatic or an extremist. In order to make it seem legitimate to fight against a group whose members are willing to die when fighting back, one has to represent their suicidal dedication as completely irrational and pathological. However, some of the societies out of which suicide terrorism has arisen have their own positive rhetoric for understanding the action. The relevant concept is that of the martyr. A terrorist who sacrifices her life to carry out an act of terrorism for a just cause is a martyr for the cause. The concept of martyrdom, which probably has a more strongly religious than secular history, can also be defined in a secular way. Both secular and religious terrorist martyrdom can seem to have transcendent value to someone who believes in the cause. The religious martyr sacrifices herself for her God. The secular nationalist martyr sacrifices herself for her people. A suicide terrorist who acts on a motivation that combines both religious and secular aims, by understanding the good of her people as embodying the glory of her God, has, so to speak, the best of both transcendent worlds. So martyrdom, whether religious or secular, has transcendent moral meaning and value in the regard of those who believe in the martyr's cause. However, this is obviously not the whole moral story. Suicide terrorism is never merely martyrdom, never merely the self-inflicted death of the agent for the sake of her people. Suicide terrorism is always also aimed at killing others. Suicide terrorism is martyrdom that kills. Its immediate victims are typically the random mix of people who happen to be at a particular location at the wrong time. Sometimes they are children or babies. Even if terrorism is justified, it is so only as the least of all evils. The morality of the suicidal part of suicide terrorism, I suggest, is this. If suicide is not necessarily wrong in its own right, and if terrorism might be justified as self-defense by a people against aggression or oppression, then the added moral weight of the terrorist's suicide depends on the independent moral value of the terrorist's act. If terrorism is unjustified under the circumstances, then it is a tragic additional waste for a terrorist to sacrifice herself for the cause. On the other hand, if the terrorist act is justified, then the terrorist's suicide is a morally valuable act of supreme self-sacrifice for an oppressed people. Like any act of supreme self-sacrifice for a greater good, the act would be both noble and tragic at the same time. However, everything depends on the independent moral value of the terrorist act under the circumstances, the killing that's involved in it, and in particular on whether the intentional killing of innocents or non-combatants is justifiable at all in that case. The suicidal dimension, I suggest, does not have an independent moral significance of its own. My next question is this. What else enters the moral equation when a suicide terrorist is a female whose society is severely female subordinated? Let's consider the Palestinian struggle against Israel, and let's return to the example of the first female suicide terrorist for the Palestinian cause, Wafa Idris. Wafa had gotten married in 1991 at the age of about 16. She became pregnant only in 1998, but the pregnancy ended in a premature delivery of a stillborn daughter. The family was devastated by this event. After this trauma, a local doctor told Wafa and her husband in front of their families that she was unable to carry a pregnancy to term. She would never have children, the doctor said. After this trauma, Wafa went into a severe depression. She stopped doing household chores, stopped eating and talking, stayed in bed all the time. Her husband, Ahmed, simply did not know how to change Wafa's behavior. So a year later, he divorced her. She was about 24 years old. 2 weeks later, Ahmed married another woman. 2 weeks later. Wafa Idris's mother, Maybrook Idris, said, quote, "My daughter's husband divorced her because she couldn't have children. Wafa knew she could never marry again because a divorced woman is tainted. She was young, intelligent, and beautiful and had nothing to live for," end quote. Wafa's husband sent her back to her childhood home. However, Wafa's father had died years earlier, and her brothers, who were therefore responsible for her support, each had their own families and were not wealthy. Because of her divorce and believed sterility, she could never marry again. As well, Wafa had no cultural options for becoming self-sufficient, nor could she leave the situation to make a better life for herself elsewhere. Commentators have said that it's even more shameful in Palestinian culture to leave one's family under those circumstances. According to Middle Eastern professor Mirat Soref, Wafa Idris was the ultimate shahida. Quote, "A talented young woman, married and divorced because she was sterile, desperate because she knew perfectly well there was no future for her in any aspect of Palestinian society. She knew better than anyone else that the only way for her to come out against this miserable situation was to kill herself," end quote. Islam provided the option, martyrdom. Wafa's influence after her death spread quickly. Fatah, of which Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade is the militant wing, held a symbolic funeral ceremony for Wafa Idris in which she was eulogized in these words, quote, "Wafa's martyrdom restored honor to the national role of Palestinian women, sketched the most wonderful lectures of heroism in the long battle for national liberation," end quote. In 2002, journalist Barbara Victor visited a school in the Jabalia refugee camp, am I pronouncing that correctly, in Gaza that was run by the UN. She visited classes of girls ages 6 and 12 in which several explained why they wanted to be shahidas, 6 and 12-year-old girls. One said, quote, "to follow my brother and in honor of Wafa Idris, who proved that women can do as much as men," end quote. According to Barbara Victor, there is now a Women for Wafa Idris Martyrs Brigade for females, which females can join as early as the age of 15 and commit their acts of shahida in their idol's name, Barbara Victor's wording. In a society characterized by severe gender inequality that constrains the life prospects of most of its women, women's martyrdom can acquire the added meaning of promoting an unusual, albeit tragic, sort of gender equality. In Palestinian society, and I'm basing this very heavily on Barbara Victor's account, women are otherwise subordinated to men and sometimes in very severe ways. However, it is now publicly believed, there's a kind of public narrative, a public rhetorical narrative, that women can attain equality by committing the ultimate sacrifice for the community. They can martyr themselves as part of the resistance against the Israeli occupation. As martyrs, they can be equal to men in morally exalted ways they can never attain through ordinary daily life. Under peaceful conditions, anything that promotes gender equality is, I believe, a good thing. Any act that elevates women's social standing and cultural esteem would be, in that respect, worthwhile. An act that is otherwise morally neutral or mixed, but not seriously wrong, would gain moral points if it brought women's social standing closer to that of men. Does the suicide terrorism of Palestinian women, though, promote genuine gender equality? One reason to think it does not is that Palestinian women may not be choosing voluntarily to become suicide terrorists. Some of these women, like Wafa Idris, have suffered personally in ways that directly reflected their subordinate status as women within Palestinian society. Wafa Idris was marginalized and her options severely curtailed because she became somehow unsuitable for marriage or motherhood. Others may have suffered dishonor and dishonored their families because they engaged in some sexual transgression, or sometimes were the mere victims of sexual transgression that was perpetrated against them. And then they were often convinced that the way to restore their own honor posthumously and restore honor to their families was through martyrdom. Barbara Victor claims that Palestinian women live under stringent social and religious rules. A Palestinian woman can get into trouble for looking at a man or refusing to marry. If she sleeps with a man, or worse yet, gets pregnant, she, quote, disgraces the family and risks death at the hands of her male relatives, end quote. Under these sorts of conditions, quote, if Palestinian women are offered equality and respect only by becoming martyrs, it is not surprising that they would choose it, end quote. That's Barbara Victor speaking. But also not clear how voluntary their choices are under such coercive pressures. Barbara Victor writes that Palestinian women, quote, understand from the beginning that men do not accept them as equals or look upon them as warriors within their ranks until they achieve paradise and are accepted as such at Allah's table. But by then they are dead. And there are no women who can testify to having had those promises fulfilled in another life, end quote. There is some evidence to think that the women in these conditions have been pressured into becoming suicide bombers by the terrorist leaders who recruited them. Based on research into the lives of Wafa Idris and 3 other women who followed in her footsteps, Barbara Victor claims that the male recruiters had managed to convince the women that only their martyrdom would redeem them and their families for some dishonor resulting from the women's transgressions. As Jan Elster points out, the leaders of terrorist organizations that recruit suicide terrorists may have reasons and motivations that differ from the individual terrorists themselves. Terrorist leaders may recruit would-be female martyrs by using the lure of gender equality to which the terrorists and not themselves committed. In that case, the leaders will be exploiting the facts of women's subordination and the prevailing rhetoric that construes women's suicide terrorism as gender equality. Yet the women's choices to become suicide terrorists, even under these conditions, may still be voluntary, I think. It matters whether such choices are rational for women to make. A completely irrational choice seems more likely to have been the product of pressure or coercion than a rational choice, however tragic the rational choice might be. If terrorism is justified for the Palestinian cause, then women would have just as much reason to choose martyrdom as would men. Conditions in the West Bank are often brutal and humiliating for the Palestinian people. It is not obvious that Palestinian women are being irrational when they sacrifice themselves for their people, and so not obvious that they are choosing to do so non-voluntarily. In a society in which women are largely excluded from public or political life, women are not routinely called upon to make sacrifices at a level of high public heroism. Usually the sacrifices expected of women would be become mothers, raise large families, sacrifice yourself in that way for the society, but not at the level of high public or political or violent heroism. This sort of role is left to men, who are held responsible for the crucially important defense of the nation or people, and who are usually the only ones to share in the glory and public adulation that political heroism and military victory confer in most societies. In Palestinian society, it seems that nationalistic self-sacrifice brings women to a level of genuine cultural honor and esteem that is beyond anything normally available to them. The shahidas as well as the shaheeds are praised, honored, and revered in death. In fact, it seems that because there are still so far fewer numbers of women involved, they get a larger proportion of public esteem than the men do, because there are now so many more men who have engaged in suicide terrorism. As Middle Eastern feminist Alice Shalvi said to Barbara Victor, quote, "If a society prizes above all else the readiness to fight for your country, if that is such a criterion for excellence, then you cannot exclude women just because they are women. It doesn't seem right that women should be excluded from attaining that kind of glory, and one can argue in a perverted way," still quoting Shalvi, "that everything has to be open to women, and if everything includes dying or killing oneself in battle, then that has to be acceptable as well," end quote. Women's terrorist activism might promote women's equality, despite the fact that terrorist leaders had no such aim in mind when recruiting or training those women. Women would be equal in that they were undertaking difficult missions of national self-defense along with men. Their very acts of suicide terrorism constitute the playing of an equal role in the serious business of defending their people against the occupation. The women's actions might also cause some real change in cultural attitudes that leads to future gains of other sorts, future gains in women's social stature and a lessening of the strictures that constrain them. Now, it is crucial to state that the aim to achieve gender equality does not in itself justify or excuse the terrorist killing of innocent persons or non-combatants. Women's subordination within Palestinian society does not justify terrorism against Israel. Israeli citizens are not the ones who perpetrate women's subordination in Palestinian society. The justification of terrorism by Palestinians has to do with whether the Israeli occupation of the West Bank constitutes illegitimate aggression against or oppression of the Palestinian people. However, if terrorism on behalf of the Palestinian people is independently justified, then it becomes relevant to consider the possibility that a suicidal terrorist act by a woman might have its own important meaning over and above what would be true of suicide terrorism by a Palestinian man. Her act, but not his, could constitute or promote an unusual sort of gender equality in her culture. This is not a happy fact. It is a tragedy that gender equality could also be realized by such means, yet it seems to be a distinct possibility. Thus, to conclude, in a society with significant female subordination, women's acts of suicide terrorism can take on an additional meaning and moral significance as the acts of women. In martyrdom, women can give as much to their communities as can men in a way that is as fully public and political as any act a man can perform. If suicide terrorism is justified independently as terrorism on nationalistic grounds, then it may constitute or promote a valuable, though tragic, sort of gender equality. For the sake of understanding the appeal of suicide terrorism to some Palestinian women, this meaning of their actions should not be ignored. Thank you.
The term Shahida is not a recently coined one. The term Shahida actually in Islamic tradition came before the term Shahid for male. And this runs for about 1400 years. So it's not that Arafat coined it and said it to people that people would go and do suicide acts. So that didn't happen. Okay. First of all. The second thing is trying to make the connection between gender equality and self-sacrifice is far-fetched, because if this is the case, we should see this this phenomenon more where societies where women are more discriminated against. And that is the case in, for example, Gulf countries where you don't see women suicide bombers. Also, if Wafa Idris wanted to get redemption for what she had suffered on the hands of her family, her society, why she didn't attack her society, why she didn't kill her husband. I think that is the logical question. If someone attacks me, I wouldn't go and attack you in an extension. So I think you need to put her situation in the gender context, and you need to mention, for example, that her dad was frequently imprisoned in Israeli prisons. Two of her four brothers were frequently imprisoned by the Israeli army. That needs to be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you for informing me about the origin of the word. I might ask one question though. Could it be that the word had not been used for a very long time and that Arafat recovered it, perhaps? Just a question about whether it was culturally familiar. In response to your second and I think also third comments, I wasn't actually trying to give a causal explanation of women's suicide terrorism. I was trying to talk about an additional meaning it might have. So I think that's an important distinction. I grant you that it doesn't sound as if it was a very good causal explanation, because then, of course, we would be moved to look at other societies in which perhaps the inequality was even more severe, yet where there was some sort of terrorist movement, and wonder why women weren't participating there. And of course, there are contexts such as the Tamil Tigers in which women are participating at a much higher level. Do we find the same kind of subordination there? Is it more severe? It looks as if the explanation may have different sorts of causes, but I wasn't actually trying to give a causal explanation. I was talking simply in terms of meaning and moral assessment. That would be my other concern as a philosopher of ethics. I'm wondering whether or not the act is in any sense justified, and if it's justified, does it have some additional kind of moral significance that might make it even more justified? And I gave a very convoluted, sort of qualified answer to that question. But I take your point about causal explanation quite well.
Thank you. I think we can have to stop now. It's really good lunch.
Thank you very much. Just a quick announcement. If you have already made a reservation for lunch and a seat is being held for you at the lunch, there will be vans outside to take us collectively to that lunch.